Okay, it's about time we should carry on. So let me introduce to you Michael Hughes, independent APL consultant, friend and tormentor of me, who's going to talk to us about some work that he's done to sort of help bridge the gap between the Quad WC that you're used to and the WPF stuff that you've seen from myself and Chad earlier this afternoon. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you. Well, as I say, you saw this morning some very, very impressive stuff from John about the data binding. You've seen the controls from SyncFusion. And if you're anything like me, it completely blew my mind, the possibilities of WPF. And you're probably sitting there thinking, well, that was all very pretty and very exciting, but it doesn't look anything like the application code I've got now. And how on earth am I going to get from where I am to this? It's almost worth not considering. And when I gave a talk on WPF way back in, I think it was 2010 in Berlin, everybody said, oh, this is wonderful, this is lovely, can I do this, can I do that? And the first question they said was, what about the WC grid? Can I do an APL grid? And I thought about it and said, actually, no, there's nothing you can do with that. Oh, I'm not interested. And they went away. But I still like WPF, and I persevered, and I played. And I tried writing my own APL grid, which ran, but very, very slowly and very badly. And then I started looking around other controls and what else was around. And I looked at all DevExpress and all the usual ones people look at, and none of them really sort of gelled for the grid, that sort of thing, and I didn't really get on with them. And then a friend in Montreal, in Canada, I was helping him with stuff and doing some work with him, and he said, well, there's these SyncFusion people, what do you think of them? I'd never heard of them. So I downloaded the test trial thing, and I just played around with a few things, and they were very nice. And then I found this grid control that Chad showed you. And I thought, oh, actually, this is a bit APL-like. I can do something with this. And in fact, that's what it's turned out. And it's actually working out as quite a nice mapping to the APL. And so that's what I decided to do. And then, during the time since 2010, I've also been thinking, well, actually, linking up events and things like this are not very easy. So I've actually put a lot of work into allowing you to do all these sort of things in a WC-friendly, APL-friendly sort of way. And so it's just a very quick brief to go through here. I should be doing much more of this stuff on Thursday, 3 hours, so we can actually go into things in more detail. But all of this presentation is in 13.2, because I actually had to write my own version of data binding with a data source, because a certain person wouldn't listen. and so this is all in 13.2, and the data binding is working exactly the same way as John's, but mine's an APL, couple of APL classes. So it doesn't tie into the interpreter as well as his does. It doesn't do a few things. It actually does do data tables. Mine does deal with matrices, but I thought I'd get that one in. But I'm sure he'll catch up. But whatever he's been doing over the last 2-3 years with WPF, I've been writing my stuff as cover functions. So in fact, all I do is when John does something, I slot it in, and it all still works. And that's going to happen with data binding. So there's going to be a few differences on the first slide I show you here, in as much that there is an APL colon in front of my binding, which when he does what he's doing, then I shall replace that. I also will be showing you the APL grid, and you'll see that I'm not using XAML, I'm using APL. And that's because I'm coming from the other end. I'm looking at migrating from APL towards using WPF. So we're all the APL side, not the XAML side. Everything I show you could be done in XAML, in exactly the same way. I'm not doing that, but you can do that. So you can do anything in APL, anything in XAML. John is perfectly correct. You should be doing it in XAML. It's much better. It's easier to get loads of stuff off the internet. You should be doing it that way. But if you're migrating from somewhere else, you start with APL and work your way towards it. I recommend. So we go back to this. Are you worried? Are you puzzled? No, are you worried about implementing anything WPF? Well, he says, assuming this thing works. So, as I said, don't panic, because that's the best thing to do. Because, as you can see, come down here, there are ways of making the WPF accessible to APL developers. Now, you'll see here, I've got XAML, examples, and APL. Here you can see that there's a function here, event add, which adds a click event function. That's your callback function to the object. So that's quite, WC eventing. That actually used to do all the calls in .NET to do the linking. Then when John introduced the IBeam 2016 that he showed you, that now calls and uses that IBeam. And as things go on, the cover functions will use the stuff that John implements later on. And again, with commands, there is a nice way and a way of doing this. So I've got functions for setting commands. You can do this. Now, you'll notice there's an APL colon there. That's because I've written a markup so that in curly brackets, I know John says that XAML is very declarative. There are times when you want to do things with XAML, even though he says this. And effectively, those curly brackets are your exit out to do things. Yeah, sort of. Certainly more so. So again, this is for linking the command to the command. So again, you can do both in APL and not ever. So wherever you need things, this line is almost, you could replace your quad WC event with that line, and it would do the same thing, call the thing. I've even implemented it so you can actually have an optional left argument. That's not WPF, but it's something you can do. So if you had a left argument to your callback function, by putting a third element on that list, then the callback function that comes through would actually have a left argument as well. So you can even emulate that much of quad WC. So I'm doing as much as I can to try and make it an easy job to start with quad WC, move to WPF, and then expand further into the WPF world and get everything that John and Chad showed you. So that's the thing. Also, for example, I've got a template for commands. So you can't actually create a command in WPF. I've been nagging John about that for ages, but I have a VS template that you can complete and then compile to get those. And there's all sorts of other helpful utilities that I can make available through Dyalog that people can deal with WPF. And again, with data binding, you'll notice that the two up there, you can do it in APL, and you can also do it through XAML. And you'll see the data context line. Again, now that John's introducing his stuff, I was working with this all, and I was debating whether I could use John's stuff, but with 3 weeks before the conference, I thought, no, I'm not going to risk putting all this in. So ultimately, that APL colon will disappear, and you'll be using exactly the same as John's. He hasn't actually got that big. He's talking about putting the data context in the XAML, but I can actually put the data context in the XAML, so the whole thing. I can actually compile an entire application with XAML and VS into a VS executable, or you can run the same code, loading it into an APL workspace and running it that way. So you can do either thing, so we've got everything covered. I'm supposed to be working on some documentation that's aimed at an APL developer. Everything I'm doing is trying to make it APL friendly. So I'm starting at the WC end and working towards WPF, rather than saying, this is how wonderful WPF is. You all know how wonderful it is, but we've got to get there. And I've also, because of that, because of 2010, I'm actually working my way through the properties and methods of the APLW grid. And so far, I have implemented quite a few, and I've looked at all the others, and I know a way of doing every single method and property and event in the APLW grid. So we will, hopefully fairly soon, have a complete APLW grid that we can use to migrate from the WC one we're using now. I say, XAML combination as well, and the SyncFusion controls makes it much easier for somebody from an APL environment to work. Right, so I think an APL developer can work with it, and I think it's actually very simple, because it's like APL. I fell in love with APL because it's consistent. If you know how a function works, you may not know what it does, but you know it takes a left argument, takes a right argument, and you can go and look in the reference card. You've got a reference card, you go and look in that, and you know what that's going to do. It may take you a while at first to work out what a line of APL is doing, but you know how to do it. You know every function has a right argument, or it has a left argument, and you can work your way along the line, slowly working your way through and work out what a line of APL means. It's the same with WPF. If you know what a dependency property is, you know that it behaves in a certain way, you know how to bind it, etc., etc. Or every dependency property binds in the same way, so you understand it. You may have to go and look up what that property means, but you can actually work with it like all the other properties. In the same way, one function does a different thing, whatever. And the same with commands. One command works like another command. So once you understand how one command works, you can use all the others. It's consistent all the way through. And data binding, once you know how to bind one property, you can bind all the others. So it does work quite nicely. So for example, here, you've got the using thing before that John said. So you've got the using, and you've got MJ Software's my company, so I trade up like that, and the APL grid. So that's just a using. Now that could be one of the XMLS things in the top of the XAML, and it would work in the same way. This is why I put diamonds in. And so now you will see a lot of flickering today, because what I'm doing is I'm doing things in the wrong order. I'm actually creating an object, and then normally you would change all the properties, then you would put it into the visual tree. Because I want to show you what's happening, and put it into the visual tree before I change it. So you'll see things moving around on the screen, which you wouldn't normally see because you do it in the other way around. You'd make all your changes, and then you'd put it in the visual tree. Because I want to show you some things, I'm doing it the other way around. I'm putting it into the visual tree, and then I'm making changes to it. So you'll see things flicking around, just to warn you. So I've just created a window. This is just to show you things work. Focus on that, then it responds. Right, so, yeah, that's it. So it's just setting the thing up there. Right, so this is just what's going through. So I'm just setting the content thing, so it's just doing standard WPF stuff. I'm adding a combo box to show that it's just a combo box, the border. Now this is where the WPF grid's coming in. Let's say it's going. Go through these very quickly. These are just properties you're setting. So I think that's the scroll viewer. Horizontal thing, this is going to get those working properly. You see how the things are flicking around and sorting themselves out. Now I'm creating a grid. Right? So this is like quad WC grid. And create that. And then I'm now adding it to the scroll viewer. And there's your grid, and you've got a square at the top, which is an empty grid. And then I'm adding a text box at the bottom. This 8 just fits in with it. So the grid is in the middle between the two combo boxes of the text box. And now this standard thing, grid object values, 2 by 3 out of 6. And you get that. It's quite nice. And then the nice thing is, get binding. Now that, at the moment, is 13.2 data binding, but this is the bind object that comes out the other end is basically what John is creating. It's a data source binding. Yep. And so then, again, you saw John earlier. He did one of these changes, the bind.two-way. So again, because these things are text boxy type things, they also don't do the two-way binding until you explicitly say so. So that's just setting a property, and then I actually am binding the values property of the grid, yeah, to a variable called testBind in that example. Right? Now, again, because values is a dependency property, you can do this. Now, every single property that I create on the grid is a dependency property. So row titles, col titles, whatever, they all could respond to variables in the same way. Right? I'm just using values because it's quite an important one. So again, now I'm signing to a larger and more interesting thing, and it's there. Right? That's data bound to the API grid. Now I could have said g.values is assigned the same thing, and it would work, but I think data binding is nicer. And again, you can change the variable, and it is object. Yeah? At least it's working, and you've got text there. So you can see how it's working. Now, here you see I'm using my event. So I'm actually, this is the index changed event. I've got a function through index changed, and my grid object on next. So it's almost like quad WC, very similar. Right? And this is the function I'm defined. Now you notice that there's an args.row column, so I've got a row column in there. Right? So then listing. Now you see it's a standard WPF function. You've got callback that John showed you, the change, the send at the args, and then line. And you'll see there's an args.row and column, which are fields. And hope this will work. Oops, I didn't do the move the. So if I move the grid, I'll get out of the way. Like so, it stops because the index at the top left-hand corner is changing. So now I've got that, so now I should have put the focus back on this window. All right, so you go back, listen to that one. All right, then I do that one. Put a stop in it, I can do a stop again, that doesn't matter. And then if you look at sender, that's the name of the grid. So standard WPF staff, it's the name of the thing. It behaves exactly like an object in the same way. And then if you go again, args is that. You'll see it's an API grid cell rooted event args. So standard stuff. And if you look at the properties, you can see there's all the stuff because John used original source in his example. So that's there, and all the standard ones are there. But you'll notice there's a row and there's a col. So I've created new properties for that. So that's how that works. Put that back off. And go to see. And because I did it several times, you can see how it's moved. So that's how that. And then you can change total. I think I'm going to put that back to the beginning. Go back to the top. And you'll see again the index changed, fired again. So I've changed that. Did I start doing something? All right, that one? Right, yeah. Now, I think there's a slight bug in my code here because these are default values on the left and I don't actually indent them the way I'm supposed to. But if I actually put values there, they do indent properly. And then the depth. Right, now this is the interesting one I wanted to show you. This over here, that one there. If I show you here, you've got the little icon, the 1. The rows have actually collapsed in the same way. Now, I'm actually going to want to emulate the tree, so I get all the little dotted lines down here that we have. Now, the grid control doesn't really allow me to. I've had lots of discussion with SyncFusion how to do this. They keep saying I should use another control, but that doesn't do other things, so it really is horrible. But what you have to know is that that cell up there, these ones here, they're actually a data templated cell. And that actual cell, it looks very, very easy with just the plus and the 1, but that's actually a grid. It's actually XAML that's been compiled that I've actually done with the quad new into this thing. So that's actually a compiled XAML, completely separate, comes in. It's just easier to define it in XAML. And it's actually a grid that's about 3 or 4 rows, 4 or 5 columns, and what I've got is 3 border objects in there and an image and the text. So what I can do then is draw the borders. When I come to draw my tree, I can actually work out which borders to draw my trees, to get the tree object, as if I'm drawing on top of the grid. So that's what I'm doing. But it just shows you that in any cell in this grid, you can put anything. So all those charts and all the stuff that, that Chad was saying, once you move on and get past the simple stuff, which I'm showing you now, you can make the grids look as sophisticated as the ones that Chad was showing you. So it's very, very powerful stuff. But my brief is only at the moment to try and get as close to an APL grid that we have with Dyalog at the moment. But this gives you access to everything that the charts, that are the grids that SyncFusion have. So at the moment, I'm providing extra properties and extra methods to emulate the APL grid we have now, but you have access to everything else that he was showing you on top. Right, and put that back. And then something else, there's a last thing to show you. Oh yes, this is quite nice. Now, I haven't wired up so you get the values back yet, but you can actually import from Excel so that you can just import straight in. Now, it's not very exciting. You'll see why it's that box in a minute. But that is an entire Excel spreadsheet that's come in. And I just need to tie up one more event, and that would actually be in values. I haven't quite decided what to put in cell types yet. But I mean, in theory, you could just import an Excel spreadsheet into your grid, and then you should have values and things as before. So, that's quite nice, I think. I think that's it on that one. Yeah, good. Just 1 second. Get rid of that one. And then, just as what I could do with, as I've asked several people, if anybody's got an interesting grid, that they can send me the code and the grid that's not confidential. I would love to have these grids just to play with to test this, because obviously I don't use the grid myself a lot. I'm converting the properties and what have you, but I really could do with some lovely test cases to try this out on. And of course, that means you would get a migration basically free of charge, because by the time I finish with it, you should be able to put it into your application anyway. So if people could send me a grid that's interesting, I would love to receive some different grids just to test this thing out. Anyway, that's not the one I want yet. I want the other one. The first grid, I started doing this as a sort of a way of testing. The first grid that's in the Mastering APL manual, I actually used that as a trial thing to see if I could do that. So if I go through and do this, the using as usual, and the end grid, a window. Again, this will flicker because I'm doing the show first. So I'm just setting that. I stop shaking is the best thing. Oh, I hate doing these things. Right, content. This is just sort of setting up some standard properties in the same way. Now I'm putting a title on, and then a button. Now you'll see, this is quite weird. When you put the button in, first of all, it fills the whole window. Now again, this wouldn't be seen because normally you wouldn't put the button in the visual tree until later. But this just shows you how things move around as you do it. I put content in the middle. I think it's quite nice how it moves. That's quite because it's a maximum width. With WPF, it's far better to talk about maximum width, minimum width, rather than width. Because if you move your window, the user decides to make the window twice as big. If you set a fixed size, the windows stay the same size. And some objects you want to grow within certain constraints. So it's far better to use min width, max width, rather than straightforward widths. It's almost a cardinal sin to commit to width directly. Although I think I use it. All right, now, here again, I've got another callback that's quite interesting. You'll see this one has got an F on the end, which is the form control. So this is emulating the quad WC event with a left-hand argument. And if I look at the function, indeed, it's got a left argument, which is actually the window class. So again, this isn't needed if you don't want it, but I'm trying to get as close as possible as I can to the Dyalog quad WC entries. So that had a possibility to put a left argument to your callback functions. This is definitely not WPF. This is non-standard WPF, but we have it in Dyalog now, so I'm trying to emulate it to ease the migration across. So again, if you want to use left arguments, you can. Where am I? Scroll viewer. Content. All right, I'm very quick. I'm back. You want me to speed up? Say it's gone stop. And these things, just want to show you this. Enter. All right. Create the grid. Put it in the content so it's there again as before, empty. And some values you'll see there. And as I go further through, you can see I'm setting title width, cell width, all the ones we're familiar with from the Quad WC grid. This can all be done in XAML if you wanted to. It's just that you're not coming from XAML when you start. And again, I can set the cell types, I can set the different colors, and things like this, and nothing happens all the way through. I can create a font object, I can create all these sort of things, cell fonts, get signed, a text box in the same way you would normally with your inputs. Nothing's happened yet. Put a combo box, create a combo box, etc. And then somewhere down here is an input. Right, so if I push enter, you say, hey. Thank you. Right, so done that, and it's all right. And then you go down a bit more, you do show input. So all these things are all standard Dyalog boxes. You get your checkboxes. And they come down, take them off. Now, I have done this as a column because the mastering APL example is columns, but this is all based on cell types. So each of those could be mixed and matched in the same way the Dyalog one does. Well, it is the Dyalog one, I mean. Yeah. So that's that. And again, you can look at the first 5 values of values, so you can exactly the same as an APL, and that's that. Good. And then the last one, you really see this, but using all these tools, you end up where you can use something like this. Yep. And then you run this. And this is built using all the sort of things. Now, this does not look good on this resolution, I'm afraid, but I can show you this if you're interested. But this is actually merging 2 SyncFusion controls, which is basically their diagram control that Chad was saying on the left, and it's their overview, isn't it? Overview on the right. And I have to say, that's at the top at the moment is the Microsoft ribbon rather than their ribbon, because I didn't know about them at the time I wrote that bit. In fact, the diagram, I actually wrote a version of the diagram myself because nobody else had a diagram that I'm aware of. I couldn't find one, so that was replaced what I found. But this is quite nice because you can move this around, you see? Quite nice. And this actually has data binding on, so that if you change the zoom and pan up here, if you change this, this is what I'm doing, plus, for example, it zooms, and that is actually data binding. And I can't show you this because I set it up so it didn't go into the workspace, but on Thursday I will show you that that's actually assigned to a variable. There's a variable called hash.s4r.zoom%. You change that to a value, the zooming happens. So that's actually a data bound. The zooming is actually done by data binding, as is a few other things, but I can only show this in the workspace, I can't. That's basically what I want to show you, but everything can be done with APL. I can now compile APL and XAML into a VS executable. I can use the same project to actually load APL and load the stuff into APL and produce exactly the system. This system, with the same code, runs either as a VS executable, no, in VS Studio, and actually compiling it into an executable. This will work. It'll also work in APL. And it's a mixture of XAML and APL. But that's it, basically. But, I mean, all these things, if you contact Dyalog, you can have a copy of whatever's there. Any questions?
So are there any questions for Mike? Yes, hold on.
Hi, Mike. Hello.
Oh.
So my questions have I'm coming from a Causeway point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So they have a little bit of that flavor to it. So in Causeway, you can take part of a variable. You can say 3pick of something. In the data binding that both what John showed and you showed, can you do something like that?
At the moment, you can only do data binding by changing the data source. So you can, by indexing, change something. By doing a 3take, at the moment you can't, but we're only working our way through. I suspect being APL orientated, we'll have to work towards something like that. At the moment, if you change a row like I was doing with the values, you can do that. But something that involves taking something out that doesn't change the underlying structure of the data you're working with, you can't at the moment. But that's true of, of course, all the data binding. But it's only if you assign data do you actually get data binding to kick in. And if you do a 3-take, you're not actually assigning data.
No, you could change the 3-pick of...
Oh, it means 3-pick is assigned?
Yeah.
Oh, that works.
That works. Okay. And there's a concept of pre- and post-validation where you can actually reject the value.
Yes. Again, and this is true of the stuff that John was showing you with the new one and the one I'm working with. You create, we're doing is creating a data source. So it's at the very beginning of the data binding process. We then use a binding class, which is standard WPF. And from there on, it all works through, and you can use all the validation mechanisms within WPF to do that. So yes, you can do that. And also, if you're setting a dependency property, at the moment, this thing is built by parsing, and I put everything in .NET. And I keep working on this chap, and we've already, in 14, he's created, you know how you have colon property? Well, he's actually created, is it colon property dependency, or is it dependency, I can't remember. But in version 14, he now has created a colon construct for the dependency property, and I'm also working on him to do all the others. So ultimately, the parser that generates these classes for me, because the only thing I change to create these classes, I create about 5 variables in APL, one called properties, one called methods, one called events, one called event handlers, and these are just pure APL variables. I use the APL functions that run on each property change for each of the properties. That's it, and that's all I create. And from that, I then build the entire .NET class. I mean, it goes through and parses those and actually builds it. So you're only ever working in APL. And then you just say, build this class, and the whole thing goes around using those APL variables and those functions, and it wires all together and generates a WPF class. So, you can have a validation on each dependency property as well.
Okay, we need to move on to the next session. If there's any other questions, very, very quickly. Okay, in which case, thank you, Michael, and we'll just swap over. Give us 2 minutes to get Brian, I think, next, isn't it? Thanks, Mike.